My name is Mark Janssen. I'm 54 years old, and for 28 of those years, I was a conservation officer with the Michigan Department of Natural Resources. I've spent more time in the woods than most people spend in their own homes. I've tracked poachers in the dead of winter, tranquilized nuisance bears in suburban backyards, and pulled lost hikers out of swamps you wouldn't think a man could drown in. I thought I knew the woods. I thought I understood the natural order of things, the clear and unwavering line between predator and prey, between man and beast. I was wrong. I'm telling this story because the official report is a lie, a neat and tidy fabrication designed to close a file. But I was there. I know what happened at my father's cabin in the Ottawa National Forest, and I know that what killed Brian Sobel was not a bear. The cabin was my inheritance, a small, sturdy box of cedar and pine my father built with his own hands on a plot of land deep in the Upper Peninsula. It wasn't much, just a main room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen, and a loft for sleeping. But it was our sanctuary. It sat at the end of a 10-mile stretch of gravel and dirt that the county barely acknowledged was a road. Out there, you were on your own. No cell service, no neighbors, just miles of unbroken forest in every direction. For me, that isolation was the whole point. It was a place to disconnect from the noise and reconnect with something real. That October, I'd driven up for our annual hunting trip with my old partner, Cal Rask. We'd worked together for 2 decades and had retired within a year of each other. He was the kind of man you wanted by your side when things went south. Calm, methodical, and built like a lumberjack. This year, he'd brought along his nephew Brian and Brian's friend Corey. They were in their late 20s, full of the kind of easy confidence that comes from never having been truly tested. Brian was the joker, always ready with a sarcastic comment, a city kid who viewed the woods as a rustic theme park. Corey was quieter, more serious. He'd done a few years in the National Guard, and he carried himself with a discipline that Brian lacked. He respected the woods, but he didn't know them, not like Cal and I did. The first 2 days were perfect. The autumn air was crisp and clean, smelling of pine needles and damp earth. The maples and birches were a riot of gold and crimson against the deep green of the firs. We spent the days scouting for deer sign and the evenings playing cards by the fire, drinking beer and listening to Cal's exaggerated stories from our days on the job. It was comfortable. It was normal. It was the last time I would ever feel truly at peace in that cabin. The change began on the 3rd day. It was subtle at first, something you feel more than you hear. We were out walking a ridge about a mile from the cabin when I realized the woods had gone silent. Not quiet, but silent. There were no chattering squirrels, no blue jays scolding from the branches, no woodpeckers drumming against dead trees. The air was unnaturally still, heavy and oppressive. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Cal noticed it too. He stopped mid-stride and just stood there, head cocked, listening to the nothing. "You feel that?" he murmured, his voice low. I nodded. It's like the whole forest is waiting for something. Brian, of course, didn't get it. Waiting for what? The grand finale of leaves falling? Come on, guys, it's just the woods. He kicked at a log, the sound unnaturally loud in the profound stillness. Corey just watched us, his expression unreadable, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. He felt it too. The feeling didn't pass. It lingered for the rest of the day, a low-grade hum of wrongness just beneath the surface of the world. We cut our scouting trip short and headed back to the cabin, the silence following us like a shadow. That night, the second strange thing happened. We were all asleep when a sound woke me. It was a deep, rhythmic thumping, coming from somewhere out in the darkness. Thump, thump, thump. It was slow and deliberate, each impact carrying a weight that vibrated through the floorboards of the cabin. I lay there in the loft, listening, my heart starting to beat in time with the sound. It wasn't a woodpecker. It was too slow and powerful. It wasn't an animal rubbing against a tree. It was too consistent. I heard Cal shift in his bunk below me. "Mark?" he whispered into the dark. "I hear it," I replied. The thumping continued for another minute, a steady, unnerving percussion that seemed to be getting closer. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence that rushed back in was somehow worse. It was thick with anticipation. We lay there for what felt like an hour, listening for anything. A snapping twig, a grunt, a footstep. But there was nothing. The next morning we tried to explain it away. Cal suggested it might have been a big buck knocking its antlers against a tree, trying to shed its velvet. But we both knew it was too late in the season for that. Brian, ever the comedian, joked that it was Bigfoot knocking on his front door. "Probably asking for a cup of sugar," he said with a grin. Corey offered a more plausible yet equally unsettling theory. "Could be someone trying to intimidate us. Poachers, maybe? They see our truck, figure we're competition." I considered it. It was possible. Some of the locals in the UP were fiercely territorial. But this felt different. It didn't feel human. I decided to take a walk and look for the source of the sound. Cal came with me. We circled the cabin in ever-widening loops, our eyes scanning the ground for tracks, broken branches, anything out of the ordinary. We found nothing. No human footprints, no animal tracks, no tree that looked like it had been repeatedly struck by something heavy. It was as if the sound had come from nowhere. We were standing near the edge of a dense cedar swamp when Cal pointed. "Look at that." There, on the trunk of a massive white pine, about 8 feet off the ground, were 3 deep gouges in the bark. They were parallel, each about as thick as my thumb, and had torn through the bark and deep into the wood beneath. I ran my hand over them. The wood was splintered and raw. Whatever made these marks had done it recently. "Bear?" Cal asked, though his tone was doubtful. I shook my head. Claws are too far apart, and a bear would have left marks all the way up the trunk from the climb. This looks like something just reached up and swiped it. I looked up. 8 feet was high. A very big bear, standing on its hind legs, could maybe reach that high. But the marks weren't right. They were too clean, too powerful. We stood there for a long time, staring at the tree, the silence of the woods pressing in on us. The feeling of being watched was so intense it was almost a physical touch on the back of my neck. That afternoon, the unease in the cabin was palpable. Brian's jokes had lost their edge, and even he seemed to be looking over his shoulder more often. Corey had taken to cleaning his hunting rifle, a Remington 700, with a meticulous focus that bordered on obsessive. Cal and I just sat at the table, a map spread between us, pretending to plan the next day's hunt, but really just trying to avoid talking about what we both felt. The sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, but the beauty was lost on us. As the light faded, the woods seemed to draw closer, the darkness between the trees deeper and more absolute. The real terror began after dark. It started with a scraping sound against the west wall of the cabin, the one facing the deep woods. It was a dry, rasping noise, like a thick branch being dragged across the cedar planks. Scrape. Pause. Scrape. We all froze. Brian's face went pale in the lantern light. Corey quietly stood up and moved to the window, peering out into the blackness. "See anything?" I whispered. "Nothing," he breathed. "It's pitch black out there." The scraping stopped. We waited, every muscle tensed. Then we heard it. Footsteps, heavy. not the shuffle of a bear or the delicate tread of a deer. These were measured bipedal steps. Thud, thud, thud. They circled the cabin slowly, deliberately. The ground was soft from a recent rain, yet the steps were loud, carrying a weight that seemed impossible. Whatever was out there was massive. Brian started to hyperventilate, his breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. "What is that? What the hell is that?" "Quiet," Cal hissed, his hand on the shotgun he'd propped against the table. The footsteps stopped directly in front of the main door. We held our breath. The silence stretched for an eternity. Then the doorknob began to turn. Slowly, deliberately, back and forth. Jiggle, jiggle, jiggle. My blood ran cold. A bear doesn't turn a doorknob. A deer doesn't test a lock. This was intelligent. This was something trying to figure out how to get in. Corey raised his rifle, the barrel aimed squarely at the center of the door. Cal cocked the shotgun, the shuck, shuck sound echoing in the terrified silence of the room. I grabbed the heavy iron fireplace poker, my knuckles white. We were trapped. We were being hunted. The jiggling stopped. More silence. Then a new sound, one that would haunt my nightmares for the rest of my life. A low, wet, sniffing noise, coming from the crack under the door. A deep, guttural inhale, then a slow, rumbling exhale. It was smelling us. It knew we were in there. It was right there, just inches away, separated from us only by a few planks of wood. Brian let out a choked sob. The sound was quiet, but in the dead stillness of that moment, it was like a gunshot. The sniffing outside stopped instantly. A low growl rumbled through the door, a sound so deep and powerful it felt like it came from the center of the earth. And then a tremendous bang as something slammed its full weight against the door. The thick oak shuddered in its frame, the wood groaning in protest. "Get away from the door," I yelled, pulling Brian back. Bang! Another impact, harder this time. A crack appeared in one of the door's panels. Corey fired his rifle. The explosion was deafening inside the small cabin, the muzzle flash momentarily blinding us. The bullet tore through the door, leaving a splintered hole. A high-pitched shriek of pain and rage answered from the other side. A sound that was part canine howl, part human scream. It was followed by the sound of something heavy crashing away through the underbrush, its retreat marked by snapping branches and furious guttural snarls. For a long time, nobody moved. We just stood there, ears ringing, the smell of gunpowder thick in the air. The only sounds were Brian's ragged breathing and the frantic pounding of my own heart. The immediate threat was gone, but the fear it left behind was a living thing in the room with us. "Did you hit it?" Cal finally asked, his voice strained. "I think so," Corey said, his voice trembling slightly. "It sounded like it." We didn't dare go outside to check. We spent the rest of the night in a state of armed vigilance. We barricaded the door with the heavy dining table and pushed chests against the windows. Every gust of wind, every creak of the old cabin sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through us. We took turns on watch, but nobody slept. How could we? We knew it was still out there. We could feel it. The forest was no longer a neutral space. It was enemy territory, and the enemy was waiting just beyond the thin walls of our shelter. As the first hint of gray light began to filter through the cracks in our barricades, a sliver of hope returned. Predators, even unnatural ones, often hunt at night. Dawn was our ally. When the sun was fully up, we cautiously removed the barricade from the back window and peered out. The world looked deceptively normal. The trees stood silent and still, shrouded in a thin morning mist. There was no sign of the creature. I made the decision. We're leaving. Now. We pack what we can carry, and we get to the truck. No one argued. We moved with a grim efficiency, stuffing essentials into our backpacks. Guns, ammunition, water, first aid kits. Nobody cared about the hunting gear or the food we were leaving behind. The only goal was to get out.
Cal and I went out first, shotguns raised, to check the damage and look for tracks. The front door was a wreck. Deep, parallel gouges were torn into the wood, splintering it like balsa. Below the hole Corey's bullet had made, there was a dark, almost black splash of blood. I touched it. It was thick and sticky. At least we knew it was mortal. But it was the tracks that stopped my breath. All around the cabin, in the soft, damp earth, were footprints. They were huge, easily 16 inches long. They were canine in shape, like a wolf's track, but with one horrifying difference. They were walking on two legs. The prints showed a clear heel-to-toe pattern of a bipedal creature. The stride was immense, at least 6 feet between steps. Here and there, the pattern would change, the bipedal prints joined by impressions from what looked like large clawed hands, as if the thing had dropped to all fours to run. There wasn't one set of tracks. There were 3. "My God, Mark," Cal whispered, his face ashen. There were 3 of them. We followed the tracks of the one Corey had shot. The blood trail was heavy at first, then became sporadic as it led into the thick woods. It was joined by the other 2 sets of tracks. They hadn't abandoned their wounded. They had helped it. My last, desperate hope that we were dealing with some kind of freak, mutated animal died right there. This was organized. This was a pack. Back at the cabin, I saw Corey standing by the side of the building, staring up at the roofline. "Mark, you need to see this." I walked over. He pointed up. Perched on the peak of the roof, like some grotesque gargoyle, was the head of a deer. It was fresh, the eyes glassy and vacant. It had been placed there deliberately, a marker, a warning. This was our territory now. That was it. The debate was over. We grabbed our packs and headed for the truck, moving as a tight, cohesive unit. Corey took point. Cal and I flanked Brian, who was practically catatonic with fear. The 20 yards from the cabin door to the truck felt like a mile-long gauntlet. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every rustle of leaves was an impending attack. We reached the truck. Cal kept his shotgun trained on the tree line while I fumbled with the keys. My hands were shaking so badly it took me 3 tries to get the key in the ignition. The engine turned over, the sound a beautiful mechanical roar that promised escape. And then I saw it. The front right tire was flat. Not just flat, but shredded. Long, deep gashes were torn through the rubber, rendering it completely useless. I looked at the rear tire on the driver's side. It was the same. They had disabled our vehicle. They had planned this. They had trapped us here. The sliver of hope I had felt vanished, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. We were not going to just walk away from this. We were being systematically hunted, and our attackers were smarter than any animal I had ever encountered.
"They cut the tires," I yelled. "We can't drive out." Panic erupted. Brian started screaming, a high, thin sound of pure terror. "We're gonna die. Oh God, we're gonna die here." "Shut up, Brian," Cal barked, grabbing his nephew by the collar. "Get a hold of yourself." Corey was already scanning the area, his military training kicking in. Back in the cabin, it's the only hard cover we have. We barricade and we hold out. It's our only chance. He was right. As much as I hated the thought of going back into that wooden box, being out in the open was suicide. "He's right," I said, my voice grim. "Back inside, now." We scrambled back into the cabin, the shredded tires a testament to our hopeless situation. We slammed the damaged door shut
and threw the table back in front of it. The adrenaline of the morning had worn off, replaced by a gnawing, exhausting dread.
We were under siege, 10 miles from the nearest paved road, with no way to call for help. All we could do was wait for night to fall again, and wait for them to come back. The day was the longest of my life. We methodically reinforced our fortress. We nailed boards over the windows, leaving only small slits to see and shoot through. We rationed our remaining water and ammunition. We had 2 rifles, 2 shotguns, and a couple of handguns. Against 3 creatures of that size and apparent intelligence, it felt like bringing pocket knives to a gunfight. Corey was the one who kept us focused. He assigned fields of fire, established a watch rotation, and spoke in a calm, clipped tone that gave the illusion of control. Cal backed him up, his quiet competence a steadying presence. I tried to keep Brian from completely falling apart, talking to him in a low voice, trying to find some spark of the wise-cracking kid he'd been just a day before. But his eyes were vacant, lost in his own private horror. He just kept muttering, "It turned the doorknob. It turned the doorknob." As dusk began to settle, a new sound started, a howl, but it was unlike any wolf or coyote howl I had ever heard. It was deeper, longer, and filled with a chilling, almost human-like quality of malevolent glee. It came from the north. A moment later, an answer came from the east, then another from the west. They were all around us. They were communicating. They were coordinating. The attack, when it came, was not the frenzied assault of the previous night. It was calculated. It started with a heavy thud against the back wall. We all spun around, guns raised. Then another thud at the front. They were testing us, trying to draw our attention, to find a weakness. A rock the size of a bowling ball suddenly crashed through one of the boarded-up windows in the kitchen, spraying splinters and glass across the floor. They were using tools.
Corey and I took positions at the firing slits we'd made. The moon was high, casting a pale, ghostly light over the clearing. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, a shape emerged from the tree line. It moved on 2 legs, hunched over, its long arms swinging at its sides. It was immense, easily 7 feet tall, with a physique that was a grotesque parody of a man's. Its shoulders were impossibly broad, tapering down to a narrow waist. Its legs were digitigrade, bending backwards like a dog's, and it moved with a loping, unnatural gait. The head was purely canine, a long muzzle filled with teeth that glinted in the moonlight, topped with pointed, alert ears. Its fur was dark and shaggy, matted with what looked like dried blood. It stopped in the middle of the clearing and raised its head, and I saw its eyes. They weren't the simple, reflective eyes of an animal. They glowed with a faint reddish light, and they held a terrifying, hateful intelligence.
It looked directly at the cabin, directly at us. It knew we were watching.
Jesus Christ, Corey breathed next to me. The creature let out a low growl, and 2 more figures emerged from the woods to flank it. One was slightly smaller, but the other was even larger than the first, with a noticeable limp, the one Corey had shot. Its leg was wounded, but it was still very much in the fight. They spread out, a classic flanking maneuver, their movements fluid and coordinated. "Hold your fire until they commit," Corey ordered, his voice tight. "Don't waste a shot." They didn't charge. They were smarter than that. The big one, the leader, picked up another large rock and hurled it at the cabin. It struck the wall next to my firing slit with enough force to shake the entire structure. They were trying to break us down, to flush us out. The smaller one darted to the side, disappearing from my view. A moment later, I heard a terrible tearing sound from the corner of the cabin.
It was trying to rip the cedar planks right off the wall. Cal fired his shotgun in the direction of the sound. A yelp of pain and the tearing stopped. But it was just a diversion. While our attention was on the side, the big, wounded one made a dash for the front door. It hit the barricade with the force of a freight train. The table screeched across the floor, and the damaged door splintered, its hinges groaning. "Front door!" I screamed. Cal and I both fired through the door. The creature roared in fury, but it didn't back down. It slammed into the door again, and this time the top hinge ripped free from the frame. The door sagged inward, held only by the bottom hinge and the weight of the table. A huge clawed hand, black and leathery with talons like railroad spikes, reached through the gap, blindly swiping at the air. It was then that Brian finally broke. His mind, stretched to its absolute limit, just snapped.
With a wild cry, he shoved past me, heading for the back of the cabin. "The truck! We have to get to the truck!" "Brian, no!" Cal yelled, but it was too late. Brian threw his shoulder against the small, unbarricaded kitchen door. It burst open, and he stumbled out into the moonlight. For a single, heart-stopping second, he was frozen in the clearing, a perfect target. The creature at the front door seemed to forget about us. It let out a sharp, barking command. The third one, the one that had been tearing at the wall, moved with impossible speed. It burst from the shadows at the side of the cabin, a blur of dark fur and muscle. It covered the 20 feet to Brian in 2 long strides. It didn't bite him. It didn't maul him. It hit him with its shoulder, a blow that lifted him off his feet and sent him flying. Brian landed in a crumpled heap, and before he could even scream, the creature was on him.
It grabbed him by the leg and simply dragged him, kicking and struggling, into the darkness of the woods. His screams were terrifying, a sound of pure agony and terror, and then they were abruptly cut off. The horrifying silence that followed was broken by the sound of wet, tearing, and cracking bones. Cal let out a roar of pure grief and rage and emptied his shotgun into the woods where his nephew had disappeared. The 2 creatures at the front of the cabin, their diversion successful, their packmate fed, simply melted back into the trees. They were gone. The attack was over. They had gotten what they came for. We were left in the ruins of the cabin, the cold night air flowing through the broken door, the silence outside now filled with the imagined sounds of Brian's last moments. Cal had collapsed onto a chair, his face buried in his hands, his broad shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Corey stood rigid, his rifle still pointed at the tree line, his face a mask of cold fury. And I felt nothing but an icy emptiness. The part of my brain that processed fear and grief had overloaded and shut down. All that was left was the cold calculus of survival. Brian's horrific, sacrificial death had given us an opportunity. The creatures were distracted. It was our only chance. "We have to go," I said, my voice sounding hollow and distant to my own ears. "We run, now, while they're busy." Cal looked up, his eyes red and raw with pain. "Leave him?" "He's gone, Cal," I said, the words like stones in my mouth. "He's gone. We can't help him. If we stay here, we'll be next. We run for the main road. It's our only play." Corey nodded grimly. "He's right. They're occupied. We go out the back, stick to the trees, and we don't stop for anything." It took a moment, but the survival instinct in Cal finally overrode his grief. He stood up, reloading his shotgun with numb, mechanical movements. We grabbed our packs and what was left of our ammunition. We didn't look back at the wreckage of the cabin, at the remnants of our final, peaceful evening. We slipped out the broken kitchen door and into the terrifying, moonlit woods. We ran.
We crashed through the underbrush, ignoring the branches that whipped at our faces and tore at our clothes. Our only guide was the faint compass needle on my watch and a desperate prayer that we were heading in the right direction. Behind us, the sounds of the creature's feast had stopped. The woods were silent again, but it was a predatory silence now. We knew they would be coming. The hunt wasn't over. Every snapped twig, every hoot of an owl sent a fresh wave of terror through me. We kept glancing over our shoulders, expecting to see those glowing red eyes emerge from the darkness. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs felt like lead. Cal was slowing down. He wasn't as young as he used to be, and the emotional devastation had taken its toll. I could hear his ragged, gasping breaths behind me. We'd been running for what felt like hours when we heard it. A long, mournful howl, much closer than before. They were on our trail. The chase was on. That sound gave us a new burst of adrenaline-fueled energy. We pushed harder, stumbling over roots and rocks in the dark, driven by the primal fear of being run down. Corey, younger and in better shape, stayed in the rear, constantly looking back. "They're pacing us," he yelled. "I can see them! They're moving in the trees to our left!" I risked a look. He was right. I could see movement, a flicker of something large and dark keeping parallel to us about 50 yards into the woods. They weren't sprinting. They were herding us, toying with us, running us to exhaustion before they closed in for the kill. We came to a small, fast-moving creek. "Through it!" I shouted. "It might mask our scent!" We plunged into the icy water, the shock of the cold taking our breath away.
We scrambled up the opposite bank, soaked and shivering, and kept running. For a while, it seemed to have worked. We couldn't hear or see them anymore, but the feeling of being pursued never left. Dawn was breaking when we finally stumbled out of the woods and onto the gravel road. We had made it. We stood there, gasping for air, covered in mud and scratches, looking like survivors of a plane crash. We had walked and run for nearly 10 miles through the darkest night of our lives. We started walking down the road, putting as much distance as we could between us and that cursed forest. An hour later, a logging truck came rumbling down the road and stopped for us. The driver, a big man with a weathered face, just stared at our condition, at the guns we were still clutching, and didn't ask a single question. He just told us to get in. He drove us to the nearest town, which had a state police post. I was the one who made the statement. I tried to be calm and rational. I identified myself as a retired DNR officer. I told the trooper everything, exactly as it had happened. The strange sounds, the tracks, the siege on the cabin, the creatures, the attack on Brian. I described them in detail, their size, their canine heads, their intelligence. The trooper, a young man who looked like he'd barely started shaving, just nodded and wrote it all down, his expression a careful mask of professional neutrality. But I could see the disbelief in his eyes. When I was finished, he asked me if we had been drinking. The county sheriff came in later. He was an older man, paunchy and tired-looking. He listened to my story again, his face betraying nothing. He looked at Cal and Corey, who corroborated everything I said. Then he sighed, leaned back in his chair, and gave us the official story.
"Look," he said, his voice dripping with condescending patience. "You boys have been through a trauma. It's understandable that you're confused. What you had was a run-in with a bear. A big one, maybe a problem bear that's lost its fear of people. They can be aggressive, especially this time of year. They'll break into cabins looking for food. It probably got aggressive, and in the panic and the dark, your friend ran, and the bear took him down. Your minds filled in the rest." "That was not a bear," I said, my voice dangerously low. "A bear does not turn a doorknob. A bear does not slash tires. A bear does not coordinate an attack with two others." He just shrugged. Fear is a powerful thing. It makes you see things. We'll send a deputy and a DNR team out to the cabin. We'll find your friend. The official report will likely read, "Death by animal attack." He stood up,
signaling the end of the conversation. I suggest you all get checked out at the hospital. Get some rest. We were dismissed, just like that. Our testimony, the word of 3 experienced men, one a decorated conservation officer, was written off as hysteria. They found what was left of Brian 2 days later. The report was exactly what the sheriff said it would be. Attacked and partially consumed by a large black bear. The cabin was officially listed as vandalized by the same animal. Case closed. As we were leaving the station, an old, grizzled deputy who was nearing retirement pulled me aside. He looked me straight in the eye, his gaze heavy with a knowledge he didn't want to have. "Jansen," he said quietly, "I heard your statement. You stay out of those woods north of the river. You hear me? There are things up there. Old things. My granddad used to tell stories. We get a call like yours every 10, 15 years. A hunter gone missing, a camper torn apart. The file gets closed, but the stories don't." He clapped me on the shoulder. "Go home. Forget what you saw." But you can't forget. You can't unsee something like that. It rewrites your entire understanding of the world. Cal never recovered. He sold his house and moved downstate to live with his sister, a broken man haunted by the memory of his nephew's last screams. I haven't seen him in years. Corey re-enlisted. He said he'd rather face men with guns than whatever was in those woods. He sends me a Christmas card every year from whatever base he's stationed at. We never talk about what happened. We don't have to. I sold my father's cabin and the land it stood on to a lumber company for pennies on the dollar. I never set foot on the property again. I can't be in the woods anymore. The peace I once found there is gone, replaced by a constant gnawing fear. The silence between the trees doesn't feel peaceful anymore. It feels watchful. The darkness isn't just an absence of light. It's a presence. It's a place where things that shouldn't exist can hide. I live in the city now. I'm surrounded by concrete and steel and the noise of millions of people. It's the only way I can feel safe. But sometimes, at night, when the city is quiet, I can still hear it. That deep, guttural growl. That howl that is not quite animal and not quite human. I know they're still out there, in the deep, remote places of the world that we haven't yet managed to pave over. And I know that the line we've drawn between our world and theirs is thin. Terribly, terrifyingly thin. So I'm telling you this, not for sympathy or for belief, but as a warning. Listen to the silence. Trust your fear. And for God's sake, stay out of the woods.